I was looking forward to this launch very much because Zimbabwe is my home. I was a bit worked up because they took our books once again. I'm just praying that we can have a few books before we finish. I also want to acknowledge the presence of members of our party, the MDC. President Obasanjo, you have in front of you people who have been going through persecution. We have the youngest honorable member of parliament. She's only 25. Joanna, if you can stand up. This girl has been arrested and is being put in the West prison in the country called Chikurubi. And she's currently going through a trial. Thank you very much. We have Honorable Charlton Wendy, also a member of parliament, our Deputy Treasurer General. He's also been incarcerated and is going through trial. So I want to underscore the importance of this book. This book says to countries like Zimbabwe that democracy is the only way to go, and that democracy is the only sustainable method of consensus and consent. We have spent the last 3 days in South Africa launching this book in various parts of South Africa. The treatment which we have received is very different from the treatment we have gotten here in Zimbabwe. Certainly our books were not confiscated, and certainly President Obasanjo was moving in a motorcade provided for by the state. But Zimbabwe is a very different country, and that's why we will fight more. This book comes at a time when there is a challenge in our region, the Southern African region. There is toxicity in Zambia. Yesterday, when we did our Joburg launch, we were joined by President Hifikepunye Hichilema, the leader of the opposition in Zambia. 2 years ago, he was incarcerated for 4 months in Lusaka on a charge of treason. The factual background...
I went to see him in
the charge was treason, but the factual background to this treason was that his vehicles had stopped to give way to the motorcade of the president, Mr. Edgar Lungu, and that, according to Mr. Lungu, was treason. Last August, I tried to visit Zambia. And I was ceremoniously booted out of Zambia, so I can speak to the generosity of Zambians. Across the road in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we've had a terrible situation where a president or a person masquerading as a president hung on to power for 2 years after the expiration of his term of office. Across the road in the Democratic Republic of Tanzania, John Pombe Magufuli is trying to follow the footsteps of Robert Mugabe and others. There is a press law that has just been drafted which makes our own IPA, the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, a very democratic act. There is a process right now in respect of which President Pombe Magufuli is actually trying to amend the laws of the country to give himself sweeping powers to ban the opposition. There are also terrible things that are happening in Botswana. I know that President Chamisa, you were in Botswana a few days ago, and you would have spoken to President Ian Khama, who would have told you of the very unhappy things that are happening there, the threat to democracy that is happening there. So we live in a very tortured neighborhood. But Zimbabwe is not the only tortured neighborhood. We live in a world where the definition and narrative of democracy itself has become so contested. We live in a world that has become so cynical. We live in a world where our own value systems have been threatened by the scourge of populism, by the scourge of nationalism. And many countries whose value systems we've taken for granted are questioning those values. There are challenges in the United States of America. There are challenges in the United Kingdom. Sitting in the audience is our friend Henry Sens. I can't see where he has gone to. He comes from the United Kingdom. And I was saying to Henry a few days ago that watching Sky News, there he is on the phone, and watching the shenanigans around Brexit, you would think United Kingdom has become another little tin pot from Southern Africa. So there are many things that are happening that are questioning, democracy. But to us, in writing this book, we wanted to prove a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that all modern states are founded on the doctrine of the social contract. And at the epicenter of the doctrine of the social contract is just the consent. You cannot govern a country except with the consent of those that are to be governed. You cannot rule a country except with the permission, the gratuitous permission of those that you are governing. So that governance at the end of the day becomes a privilege that you are awarded by the electorate, by those that you are governing. And so in Zimbabwe, the biggest challenge we face is that never at any time have we given our consent freely to those that are governing us, or more appropriately, those that have been misgoverning us. But the most common struggle on the African continent has been the struggle for decolonization. It's been the struggle against apartheid. And that struggle is the struggle for one man, one vote, and that's what they called it. The struggle for one man, one vote has actually been about asserting the right to give consent to those that govern us. We didn't give it to the colonial order. We certainly are not giving it to post-independent rulers, the liberators of yesteryear. And I find it ironic that the liberation movements, which in our own part of the world has caused great disquiet, great unhappiness, and I'm not a nationalist and I make no apologies for not being a nationalist. I find it ironic that these liberation movements, who cut their teeth on the concept of one man, one vote, have done everything possible in the last 4 decades to emasculate the value system in that way, one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote principle. It's a very sad irony. And so we sought out to assert the supremacy of this vision, the vision of consent. In writing this book, however, we were faced with the challenges about contesting and competing narratives. So we were shown the examples of Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, of Malaysia, of Mahatma, and most importantly of Beijing, and what is now commonly known as the Beijing model. In terms of the Beijing model, you don't need democracy in Africa. Democracy, according to others, is a luxury that Africa does not need. Just like those who justify the one-party state argue that multipartyism was a luxury that Africa did not need and could not afford. So we are told that what Africa needs is strong men, like Lee Kuan Yew, like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, like Prime Minister Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, like President Sisi of Egypt, like President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. Some would say Idi Amin, some would say Yoweri Museveni. And that all you need is a leader who will build roads, who will build bridges. In other words, the basis of legitimacy is no longer consensus, is no longer democracy, is performance legitimacy measured in the number of bridges and dams that you can build, which is what in fact President Meles Zenawi was doing in in Ethiopia before he died 2 years ago. But we contested, and if you look at the first 3 chapters of the book, and I urge compatriots to read it, we make a strong case based on empirical study of the connections between those countries that have made progress and how open and how democratic they have been. If you look at Botswana, if you look at Mauritius, if you look at Ghana, if you look at Nigeria, I put the caveat post President Yadua perhaps. I think there have been challenges, but you can see the progress. So we make this very strong empirical case between the connection between democracy and development and sustained development. But the corollary of that is a case made for the price, for the premium, for the rent that states like Zimbabwe have paid as a result of not having a democracy. Authoritarianism has put a price, has put a cost to countries like Zimbabwe. Put it differently, autocracy has deliberately underdeveloped African economies. And I want to give an example of Zimbabwe that many of you will know. In 1990, the GDP of Zimbabwe was 7 billion US dollars. We were the second largest economy in Southern Africa after South Africa. At the time, the GDP of Zambia was a mere $3 billion. But you know that after 1990, in 1991, one-party state collapsed in Zambia. President Kenneth Kaunda was defeated in an election by the MMD led by Frederick Chiluba. May his soul rest in peace. After Frederick Chiluba, President Levi Mwanawasa came and did fantastic work in pushing the agenda for economic reform in that country, including addressing the unsustainable debt situation that Zambia had. I regret to say that debt unsustainability is back in Zambia, but back with the twins now and Coast. Then you had President Rupia Banda. Then you had President Michael Sata. So democracy was moving. Zambia managed to grow its GDP from a mere $3 billion US in 1990 to $35 billion in 2016. Zimbabwe is still staggering around 13 billion US dollars. And so Zimbabwe autocracy has put a premium. I can give another example, Botswana, on the African continent. In around 1990, their GDP was less than $1 billion. Now Botswana has got the highest per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, with a per capita income of US $9,000. Zimbabwean per capita income, we are around US $180. 79% of our people live below the poverty datum line, surviving on less than US $1.79 a day. In fact, as I said in Durban, there are people who live in extreme poverty, surviving on what is called Tsaona. You know what I'm talking about. And Tsaona, you are surviving on US 35 cents a day, which is the equivalent of 5 rands. So those in Chitungwiza, in Huriadzo, they buy a coke of cooking fat. They buy 4 leaves of vegetables, cabbage. They buy a plate of mealie meal, and your day is done. That's how the majority of our people are living, and you know that. And this is very extremely sad. And that's a price that dictatorship is put to our continent. But we also make this very strong argument. We also make the very strong argument in this book that democracy should not be equated to an election that comes one day after 5 years. Yes, elections are important, but democracy should not be restricted and limited to a one-day event that occurs once every 5 years. If that was to be the case, then Zimbabwe would be the most democratic country in the world, including over and above the United States of America. Since 1980, we've had 11 general elections, but they've not delivered anything. And if you remember that before 2008, we didn't have harmonized elections. We used to have presidential elections separately, local authorities elections separately, and parliamentary elections separately. I did a calculation the other day. We've had 34 elections since independence, since 1980. So theoretically, we're more democratic than the United States of America. But that is not the case. If democracy is to have a meaning, it must be substantive democracy. And the democracy substantive is, of course, the building of an economy that is inclusive, an economy that creates jobs. In our SMART program, we wrote about the vision of $100 billion US economy. Yes, a sustained growth rate of at least 10% per annum. We were in South Africa the past few days. It's ironic that in a country like South Africa, a place like Sandton, which is the financial center of Southern Africa, 7 kilometers from Sandton, you have Alex Park, or like Alexander Town, which is dominated and filled with sharks. So one of the world's richest financial centers is surrounded by one of Africa's poorest centers. And every African city in the world has got its own Alex Park. We have Mbari, we have Magaba. Nairobi has got Kibera, the biggest ghetto in the world, if one likes. So if democracy has to work, it must carry everyone on board. It must be accompanied by growth that is inclusive and growth that has jobs. And this is the point which we make in the first book, Making Africa Work. How do you make economies work? You make economies work by opening up, by allowing the market to work. But the market has got its own failings. So you allow social intervention. You cannot have dirigism. 40 years after the collapse of Eastern Europe, 40 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you cannot have dirigism. Here in Zimbabwe, President Obasanjo, we have got a command economy. There's something that is called the command agriculture, which has spent more than $4 billion US in the past 4 years. But we have nothing to show from this command agriculture. In fact, this year alone, our government has just put an appeal to the UN and to the World Food Programme, in respect of which they've requested food assistance for 7.5 million people. And it is common cause that more than 2 million Zimbabweans are in a vulnerable status quo. Part of the offshoot of a command economy is that we cannot even get a single dollar from our banking system. We've got money that has got totems. We use a currency called the RTGS dollar. I don't know what that means. So the issue of a sustainable economy is important. Secondly, we need democracies that are founded on a constitution. A constitution is an agreement. A constitution is consensus. And the Zimbabwean constitution, like the South African constitution, was a byproduct of negotiation. It's not a perfect document, but it's a good starting point. I'm a practicing lawyer. I enjoy the privilege that you can go to court carrying a constitution with a substantive bill of rights that you can use to question the status quo. Third is, of course, institutions. In Zimbabwe, we have what are called Chapter 12 institutions. These include the Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Gender Commission, the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. Those commissions are important because they safeguard the interests of the people. But it's not just these institutions that are important. The citizen is very important, and the citizen is found in civic society organizations. I want to acknowledge, for instance, the role that the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights has played in this country in defending people that have been abused, that have seen abuses of human rights. The Doctors for Human Rights in treating and looking after people that have been victims of abuse, the trade unions, the churches, civic organizations are important. Democracy also requires leadership. Leadership is an essential part of democracy. We were debating in the past 3 weeks whether Africa needs strong men or women or strong institutions. And our submission is that it needs both strong leaders, strong institutions, and strong constitutions. The two go hand in hand together. And leadership is about sacrifice. I first knew President Chamisa when we formed the MDC in 1999, and he had no hair on his head or also. And so the struggle has been long. I once had a talk with President Kofua of Ghana. He spent 27 years in the trenches. President Wade of Senegal. He spent 25 years in the trenches. We buried President Changirai only last year. He spent over 20 years in the trenches. President Obasanjo has been at it since the 60s. So it requires serious commitment. It requires serious sacrifices. And if you speak to all these leaders that I have spoken to, their families don't know them. They're raising children that they don't know their fathers. They're raising children that don't know their mothers because of the ultimate sacrifice that is required. That for Zimbabwe, the struggle can become too long. And when the struggle becomes too long, sometimes there's a temptation to get seduced by shortcuts. That's why in other African countries, you hear of guerrilla movements in mountains. But it doesn't work. It's not sustainable. So we here in Zimbabwe, we have had so many bumps, so many hiccups. We've taken so many body blows. We've lost so many comrades. The challenge is not to fall. You always constantly fall. The challenge is how do you pick yourself up, raise yourself up, and look the beast in the eye and say, we are coming for you. There will be a democratic, sustainable Zimbabwe one day. I thank you very much.